So there's this villain in the Bible who shows up in the very first book, ruins absolutely everything, introduces death to the world, and becomes Christianity's ultimate bad guy. The serpent in the Garden of Eden. You probably know the story. He's a snake like creature. He deceives Eve. She eats of the fruit. Adam follows suit. And then, boom, paradise is lost, humanity is cursed, and death enters creation. This is, according to Christian theology, the most catastrophic moment in all of human history: the fall, the rebellion that broke the world. And the serpent who caused it, well, everyone knows who he is, right? It's Satan. Except, here's the thing: the serpent in Genesis chapter 3 is never called Satan. Not even once. Not in Genesis 3, not in Genesis 4, 5, 10, or 50. In fact, the word Satan doesn't even appear anywhere near the Garden of Eden story at all. But it gets even weirder than that. The serpent isn't called Satan anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. Not in the Torah, not in the prophets, not in the Psalms. The only place where the entire Bible where the serpent is explicitly, definitively identified as Satan is in Revelation chapter 12, verse 9. And for those of you keeping track, Revelation is the last book in the entire Bible, written roughly, 1400 years after Genesis, give or take. So we've got Christianity's arch villain making his debut in chapter 3 of the first book, but not getting his name revealed until chapter 12 of the last book. And that is what I want to talk about today. How Satan evolved in the Bible. How do we go from this snake-like figure to this red guy with a pitchfork? Because when you actually dig into the text, when you look at the Hebrew, when you trace this figure throughout different periods of Israelite and Jewish history, what you find is one of the most fascinating detective stories hiding in plain sight in the Bible. It's a story about language, theology, exile, cultural influence, and how God ultimately revealed truth gradually over 1,500 years. We're going to look at what the word Satan actually means in Hebrew. We're going to examine some really, really strange passages in Job and in Chronicles. And we're going to be talking about the Babylonian exile and perhaps other religious influences. And we're going to see how Second Temple Judaism, the period between the Old Testament and New Testament, developed this concept into what we recognize in the New Testament. And by the end, hopefully, we'll understand why the serpent didn't need to be called Satan in Genesis 3 and why that actually makes the Bible incredibly sophisticated. So buckle up. This is going to be an interesting one. And also, if you aren't a Christian and are just interested in the Bible, or perhaps maybe you've been a Christian your whole life, I can guarantee you there's going to be something in this video that's going to be new to you and might challenge some common things that maybe you've been told or thought of in the past. Now, I'll also say quickly that some of these points that I'm covering in this video are, sometimes in murky waters, but I tried to discern as much as possible just to gather the most relevant information as I could. Full disclosure, I am a Christian and I approach these topics with, a sign of reverence, but my hope for you is that you can enjoy this video whether you are a lifelong Christian or a dead set atheist and everyone in between. The Bible's a fascinating book, so let's explore together and figure out who this Satan figure really is. But quickly, if you're interested in these weird little deep dives in the Bible, please consider hitting the subscribe button, as it helps me out a lot, and it's free, it's simple, and it really means a lot to me. So with that all the way, without any further ado, let's get into it. All right, so before we can understand how Satan evolved, we need to understand what the word Satan actually means, because this is where a lot of people, including, me for, most of my life, have just gotten the wrong impression. So the word Satan in Hebrew is this, and it essentially means to obstruct or to oppose, or betterly, to be an adversary. So the basic meaning of the word for Satan is just adversary, opponent, someone who is opposing you. It's not originally a proper name. That's a really important part. It's actually a job description or a role, or another term to use for that is function. And here's where it's literally already getting interesting, because in Hebrew, this is also going to be important. Hebrew, like English, does not use the definitive article the in front of proper personal names, right? Like, I'm not the Nils. That just sounds silly. So when you see the phrase in Hebrew, ha-satan, which is the Satan or the adversary, that tells you immediately that this is not a proper personal name. It's a title or a role. like saying the prosecutor or the accuser or the challenger. And I want you to keep that in mind because we're going to be coming back to that a little bit later. But now, let's look at where this word actually appears in the Old Testament. And the most famous example of this is in the book of Job. So Job chapter 1, verses 6, and I'm going to read this, and I want you to pay attention to how it's worded. Now, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Now, I just explained that this word is actually Hasatan, meaning the Satan. So not Satan, the adversary. There is a definitive article there in the Hebrew. And every single occurrence of this word in Job chapters 1 and 2, and there are multiple of them, also have the definitive article. So, who is this figure? Well, let's actually look at what he does. God asks him, "Where have you come from?" And the adversary says, "From going to and fro the earth and walking up and down on it." Okay, so this is a member of the heavenly council, the divine council, and this is a real thing in ancient Near Eastern cosmology, and his job apparently is to patrol the earth, to observe, and to keep track of what's happening. The divine council is something that I've alluded to in a handful of my videos, so let me know if you want to make a full video covering that whole thing. But essentially, it's this idea is that in the ancient cultures, just as there was like a king, and then the king had his family, his close family function as his court system or the bureaucracy, so to speak. God essentially has that same structure, but in heaven. You have God, Yahweh at the top, you have the sons of God below him, and then you have figures like angels and, messengers and stuff like that. The point is that this is a kingly courtship language. God has a council in heaven, and they essentially God partners with them in order to govern creation. God is ultimately still sovereign in that, but in the same way he uses us here, he also has a spiritual family as well. Essentially, it boils down to this idea that God presides over a group of angelic beings called Elohim, essentially spirit beings that are under God's command and partner with him in the cosmos. So then God says, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." And here's where the Satan figure crosses the line. He says, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and that all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands and his possessions and have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." Now, this is important because up until this moment, the Satan has been doing his job. He's observing, he's reporting, but now he moves from reporting to challenging. He's not just saying, "Hey, Job's doing well." He's saying, "Yeah, but if you took away all of his stuff, he'd curse you." So this is a challenge to God's own assessment. It's questioning God's judgment about Job's character. And God could absolutely blow up this angelic being in a heartbeat if he wanted to do that. But the adversary just challenged God's omniscience. Basically, God could say, "What did you say? You're questioning my assessment of Job?" And, snap his fingers and then obliterate him. But if he does that, then guess what? The question is still on the table. It remains unanswered. So everyone else in his divine council is just sitting there thinking, the adversary is gone now. But did God really ever answer the question? Maybe the Satan was right about Job and God just didn't want to admit it. But back to the Satan. God doesn't blow up this adversary. What he does say is, "Okay, you're allowed to do anything you want to Job, except you're not allowed to take his life." Because God ultimately already knows what's going to happen. If the adversary kills Job, he's just going to come back and say, "Oh yeah, Job totally would have cursed you, but I accidentally killed him before we could find out." No, we're not doing that. But you can do anything else, but you just can't take his life. And we'll see who's right. And that's ultimately the whole book. That's the whole setup right there. The book of Job is about why the righteous suffer. And sometimes the answer is, you're never going to know. We're never going to get the full picture. You have to trust God that there's a reason, even if the reason isn't made known to you. But none of it has anything to do with Genesis 3. This isn't the villain of the garden. This is a member of the heavenly court who has a specific role. But now he's crossing a line in how he's executing that role, and he's becoming adversarial in a bad way, not just in a functional way. But this is not the devil that we understand in the concept in Christian theology. And look, to some of you, I know that's probably disappointing if you were hoping for a dramatic origin story where Satan shows up in Job chapter 1 with like horns and a pitchfork, introducing himself. "Hello, I'm Satan, the prince of darkness." But no, he's basically just a middle manager with attitude problems. And when you look at other places where Satan appears in the Old Testament, it gets even clearer that this is just a common word for adversary. In 1 Kings, it says Hadad the Edomite is raised up as a Satan to Solomon. He was a human. In 1 Kings 11:23, Rezon of Syria becomes a Satan to Israel, another human adversary. In Numbers 22:22, the angel of the Lord becomes a Satan to Balaam, a divine being acting as an obstacle. And even in Psalm 109, verse 6, it says, appoint a Satan to stand at his right hand. This is that same kind of like courtroom language where you have an accuser in like a legal setting. So over and over, Satan is just the word for someone who's opposing you. It's what they are in that context, not who essentially they are as a person. So if you get cut off in traffic in ancient Israel, you could technically call that guy a Satan. Would it be grammatically correct? Yeah. Would it be spiritually accurate? I don't know, probably yes. But would it help the situation? Probably not. So we've got this word that means adversary, and it's used all over the Old Testament to describe different kinds of opposition through humans, angels. It's a legal term, military term, whatever. And in Job, it's used with a definitive article to describe a specific role in the divine council, the accuser, the challenger, the one who tests human faithfulness. But that's not Satan with the capital S, because that's not a proper personal name yet. So the question is, when does that change? When does Hasatan, the adversary, become Satan? And to answer that question, we need to look at one of the most important textual comparisons in the entire Bible. All right, so there's a story in the Old Testament about King David taking a census of Israel. And the story actually appears twice, one in 2 Samuel chapter 24 and one in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. It's the same event, same outcome, same basic details, but there's one massive difference in how the two accounts describe who caused David to do this. Let me read you 2 Samuel 24, verse 1. Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, go, number Israel and Judah. Okay, so according to 2 Samuel, the anger of the Lord was kindled, and he, the Lord, or the Lord's anger, incited David to take the census. Now, let me read you 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1. Then Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. Hold on a second. What's going on here? This is like if your mom told the story of you breaking the vase as you knocked it over, and then your dad retells it as the demon of chaos possessed your hand and knocked it over. Same vase, same result. Very different theological implications, though. So 2 Samuel says that God did it. 1 Chronicles says Satan did it. Same event, but seemingly a different cause. Now, before we freak out about this, we need to understand when these texts were written. So, 2 Samuel was written probably earlier, around 500 BC, give or take. It's part of the Deuteronomistic, I think, history. This is like this big narrative between Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. And 1 Chronicles was written later, probably around 400 to 300 BC. And it was written by someone referred to as the chronicler, who's retelling a story of the same history from Samuel and Kings, but with a little bit of a different theological perspective. The chronicler is writing after the Babylonian exile, after the Jews have returned to Jerusalem, after literally they've spent decades under foreign rule, first by Babylon and then Persia. And here's what's crucial to understand about this. Look at the Hebrew in 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1. In the Hebrew text, the word Satan here doesn't have the definitive article. It's not Hasatan, the adversary. It's just Satan. This is the first time in the entire Hebrew Bible that the word Satan appears as a proper personal name. And I want you to let that sink in for a second, because this is a watershed moment in the text, because this is the point where the adversary seemingly becomes capital S, Satan. So what's going on here? Why does the earlier text say that God did it and the later text say that Satan did it? Well, there are a few ways to understand this. Some people say that both are true, that God permitted it and that Satan executed it. That's definitely a possibility. God's sovereignty allows Satan's activity, kind of like in Job. Both can be true at the same time. But I think there is something else happening here too. I think that the chronicler is solving a theological problem. See, if you're reading 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1, there's this uncomfortable implication here. God's anger is kindled against Israel, ancient Israel, and as a result, he incites David to do something, to take a census. And that turns out to be sinful. So imagine that. David himself realizes it's sinful afterwards, and then God punishes Israel for it. 70,000 people die in a plague. So God made David sin and then punished Israel for it. You know, that's weird, and that raises questions about God's character ultimately. But here's the thing. Before the exile, when Jews were a nation of their own and they had their own king, they had their own land, these kinds of questions weren't as pressing. God does everything, good and bad. Isaiah 45:7 says it outright. I form light and create darkness. I make peace and I create evil. But after the exile, after experiencing catastrophic suffering, after watching Jerusalem get destroyed and the temple razed and the population deported, Jewish theology started grappling with these questions more directly. How can God be good if God is also the direct cause of evil? And the solution to that emerges in Second Temple Judaism, the period between the exile and the time of Jesus. It's fascinating because they introduce a separate evil figure who acts as God's adversary, who tempts people, who tests them, who bears the blame for their evil actions, while God remains sovereign but not directly responsible. So the chronicler looks at this story in 2 Samuel and he clarifies. No, it wasn't God who incited David. It was Satan. God allowed it, sure. God permitted it, but the temptation came from an adversary, not from God himself. And in doing this, the chronicler is also making Satan into a proper name, an identity, not just a role, but seemingly a person. But that being said, there's also another really interesting idea to tie in here. So when we look at these two passages side by side, the word Satan in 1 Chronicles 21 has also been proposed to not be a proper name yet. Biblical scholar Ryan Stokes points out that this could just mean an adversary, a spiritual adversary that rose up and incited David. Either way, there's no contradiction here. There's God's sovereignty in 2 Samuel and the means by which it was accomplished in 1 Chronicles. Permission and execution. This is the same pattern that we see in Job. God permits something and then the adversary acts. Both are involved, but in different ways. What the chronicler, however, though, in my opinion, is definitely doing, whether Satan is a proper name yet or just an adversary, is solving a theological problem. The earlier text, 2 Samuel, uses active language that could be misread as God directly causing David to sin. The later text clarifies in Chronicles that no, there was an adversary involved. God's sovereignty allowed it, but the temptation actually came from an adversarial spiritual being. And this is ultimately, in Israelite history, a huge thing, because in making the clarification, the chronicler is developing the theology of the time. He's showing how divine sovereignty and creaturely responsibility work together, how God can be in control without being the direct cause of evil. And mind you, this is the first time in the Hebrew Bible that the word appears without the definitive article. Whether it's a proper name or just an adversary, this is a pivotal moment. The concept is transitioning and the understanding of all of this is developing. But why does this happen when it does? Why did it wait until after the exile period? Like, what changed? To answer that, we need to talk about Babylon, Persia, and a religion called Zoroastrianism. And it's actually crazy how much this all ties into this. So, all right, let's set the stage. So in 586 BC, the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem. They raze the temple to the ground, they deport huge portions of the population to Babylon, and then they are officially in exile. And so this is, without exaggeration, one of the most traumatic events in Jewish history. Everything that they thought they knew about their relationship with God is suddenly up for questioning. They're supposed to be God's chosen people. They're supposed to have this covenant. They're supposed to have the promised land. And now they're scattered. They're powerless. They're living under a foreign ruler in a foreign land. Their holy city, Jerusalem, is in ruins. Their temple, the dwelling place of God, is gone. And so, how do you make sense of that theologically? Then, in 539 BC, the Persians conquer Babylon. King Cyrus the Great allows the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And for the next 200 years, the Jews live under Persian rule, and then Greek rule, and then Roman rule. It's persecution after persecution, foreign domination after foreign domination. And in the midst of all this suffering, Jewish scribes and theologians go back to their scriptures. They go back to the Bible, the Torah, the prophets, and the writing. And they start reading them with new questions in mind. And here's the problem they're facing. Before the exile, Jewish theology was pretty straightforward. God does everything good and bad. Like Isaiah 45 verse 7, which I said before, I form light and create darkness. I make peace and I create calamity. God hardens Pharaoh's heart. God sends evil spirits. God brings disaster. God incites David to sin. God's in control of all of it. That's just how it works. But after the exile, after experiencing catastrophic suffering, and after watching Jerusalem, be burned and the temple razed and the population scattered, that theology that they had seemingly becomes harder to maintain. Not because it's wrong, God is absolutely still sovereign, but because new questions emerge. How can God be good if God is also the direct cause of evil? How do we explain ongoing persecution when we're trying to be faithful? And ultimately, the question that Job is trying to answer is, why do the righteous suffer? And here's what's important. They don't solve this problem by borrowing from other religions. They solve it by going back to their own scriptures and then reading them more carefully. And this directly ties into how Satan evolved. Because you see, a lot of scholars will tell you that the idea of Satan as a cosmic adversary, comes from Zoroastrianism, which was the Persian religion of the time. And yeah, the Persians had a dualistic system with a good god and an evil spirit. And yeah, there are some superficial similarities. But here's the thing. The concept of a supernatural rebellion, of spiritual beings opposing God and corrupting humanity, that's not a Persian invention. That's way older than Zoroastrianism. And so the Mesopotamians had stories about the Apkallu, these semi-divine beings who descended to earth and corrupted humanity. That also predates Zoroastrianism for centuries. And what does Genesis 6, 1-4 talk about? The sons of God coming to earth, taking human wives, producing the Nephilim, corrupting the world so badly that God sends the flood. That's also not borrowed from Persia. That's Israel engaging with and critiquing ancient Near Eastern mythology that was already there. The idea of the divine council, going back to that quickly, God surrounded by spiritual beings who carry out his will. That is all over the Old Testament. Psalm 82, 1 Kings 22, Job 1 and 2. That framework was already there. And the idea of spiritual beings who oppose God's purposes, well, Genesis 3 has the serpent. Genesis 6 has the watchers. The Tower of Babel in Genesis 11 results in God dividing the nations and assigning them over to the sons of God, which Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 makes explicit, and in which later texts understand as these nations being ruled by rebellious spiritual powers. All of that is pre-exile. All of that is in the Hebrew Bible before the Persians ever show up. So what changes after the exile isn't like the Jews suddenly invent Satan because they met some Zoroastrians. What changes is that they go back to Genesis 3, Genesis 6, Psalm 82, Job 1 and 2, and they start connecting the dots. They realize, wait, the serpent in Eden who brought death, that's a rebellious spiritual being. The watchers in Genesis 6 who corrupted humanity, those are rebellious spiritual beings. The sons of God assigned to the nations who ultimately led all the nations into idolatry, rebellious spiritual beings. The adversary in Job who accuses humans before God, part of that same category. And they start asking, is the same rebellion playing out in different forms, or is there one chief rebel who's behind all of it? And when they look at who gets the most blame, who has the greatest reach, whose rebellion had the most catastrophic consequences, it's the figure from Eden, the one who introduced death, the one whose domain is now the realm of the dead, where everything ultimately ends up. So this is why in 1 Chronicles 21 is so important. The chronicler isn't inventing Satan out of thin air. He's looking at 2 Samuel, which says that God incited David to sin, and he's saying, no, let me clarify what's actually happening here. There is an adversary involved. God is sovereign, but there's a separate figure bearing the direct responsibility for the temptation. And in doing this, the chronicler solves the theological problem. God is good, God is sovereign, but there's also a real spiritual adversary who tempts, accuses, and opposes God's purposes. And God permits his activity for reasons that we might not fully understand, just like in Job. These are really Jewish scribes wrestling with their own texts in their own historical context using their own theological categories. Now, did Jews living under Persian rule encounter Zoroastrian ideas? Sure. Would it be weird if there was no cultural contact? Yeah, that'd be weird. But the core concept of this rebellious spiritual adversary who opposes God, that didn't come from Persia. That was already in the Hebrew Bible. It just needed to be developed and clarified. And the crucial difference shows you that this isn't just copying Zoroastrianism. In Zoroastrianism, the Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, which is the two opposing forces of good and evil who are more or less equal opposites, it's called absolute dualism, meaning there are two eternal powers locked into battle. But in Judaism and later Christianity, Satan is not God's equal. He's a created being. He's under God's sovereignty. God permits his activity, but ultimately he remains in control. And the battle isn't between equals because the outcome is literally predetermined. So what exactly drove this development then? Well, seemingly the real driver was suffering plus scripture. Jews experiencing persecution asked new questions of their old texts. And when they looked carefully, they found answers that were already there, patterns they hadn't fully connected before. This bigger picture of a cosmic rebellion spanning from Eden to the exile. And that concept didn't need to be imported. It was quite the opposite. It needed to be excavated from what God had already revealed. But as the understanding of the Satan figure developed over time, this figure received some rather interesting names. And the reason is really fascinating. We're getting into the juicy stuff now. I just had to lay some historical context so that we can know that moving forward. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of the boring stuff before you can get to the exciting stuff. And this is where we are. So the Second Temple period, you get this Jewish explosion of Jewish literature. Some of it makes it into the biblical canon, some of it doesn't. Some of it gets preserved by Christians, and some of it gets discovered in caves in 1947 called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in these texts, you can watch in real time as this concept of a cosmic evil adversary develops. But here's what's interesting. Different communities and different texts use different names for this figure, referring to Satan, the devil, right? And these names aren't necessarily talking about different devils. They're describing the same adversarial reality, or at least the same role. And let me walk you through the major ones because this is, to me, it's really interesting. So Mastema shows up prominently in a text called the Book of Jubilees. This is a retelling of Genesis and Exodus written probably around like 150 BC. And Mastema he's fascinating. So the name Mastema comes from a Hebrew word meaning hatred or hostility or enmity. And in the Book of Jubilees, Mastema is the chief of the demons. He's the prince of evil spirits. But here's what's really interesting. Mastema serves a specific theological function in the Book of Jubilees. The author goes through the Torah and takes all these moments where God does something that seems morally questionable, and then he attributes them to Mastema instead. For example, in Exodus 4:24, there's this really weird verse where God meets Moses on the way back to Egypt and tries to kill him. It's a bizarre story. Why would God do that? Well, in Jubilees, it isn't God who tries to kill Moses, it's Mastema. In Genesis 22, God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Now, that's always been theologically difficult. God testing Abraham, sure, but why would God command child sacrifice even if it is a test? Well, in Jubilees, it's Mastema who suggests the test. He goes to God, and just like the Satan in Job, and says, Abraham claims to love you much, but does he really? Test him, tell him to sacrifice Isaac, and we'll see if he obeys. So Mastema takes on this Job's Satan-like role. He's the one who suggests the tests. He's the one who puts obstacles in the way. And by doing this, Jubilees gets God off the hook for these morally difficult moments. God's not the one directly causing the hardship. Mastema is. God is just permitting it. This is theodicy in action. Theodicy is this question of how a good God can allow evil. And Mastema, according to these people, is part of the answer to understanding that there's a separate evil figure bearing the blame. Like I said, this book is not in the biblical canon. Belial, or Beliar in Greek, is probably the most prominent name for the evil figure in Second Temple literature. The name appears many times in texts from this period. So the word Belial in Hebrew means worthlessness or wickedness. In the Old Testament, it's usually used as an adjective or a description of worthless people. Sons of Belial just means wicked people. But in Second Temple Judaism, Belial became personified. He becomes the prince of evil, the ruler of darkness, and the adversary of God. This is especially prominent in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered starting in 1947 near Qumran. Whole bunch of these caves. These scrolls were produced by a Jewish community, probably the Essenes, who lived in isolation in the desert. And their theology, interestingly enough, as we talked about before with Persians, in Zoroastrianism, was intensely dualistic. One of the scrolls is called the Community Rule, and in it, there's a section called the Doctrine of the Two Spirits. It says that God has created man to govern the world and has appointed for him two spirits in which to walk until the time of his visitation. The spirits of truth and injustice. Those born of truth spring from the fountain of light, but those born of injustice spring from the source of darkness. Light versus darkness. Truth versus injustice. Two spirits, two paths. Another scroll in there is called the War Scroll. A final war between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. And guess who's leading the Sons of Darkness? That's right, Belial. First attacks on the Sons of Light shall be undertaken against the forces of the Sons of Darkness, the army of Belial. This is full-blown cosmic dualism. Good versus evil, God versus Belial, with a final battle and ultimate victory for God. But now, why did the Qumran community develop this theology? Well, ultimately, they were being persecuted. They were living in a time of very intense foreign oppression. The Seleucid Greeks were trying to force Hellenization on the Jews. Some Jews were compromising with Greek culture. Others were resisting. The Essenes isolated themselves completely. They saw the world as ruled by darkness. They saw themselves as the faithful remnant, the sons of light, waiting for God to vindicate them in the final battle. And in that context, Belial makes sense. Belial explains why the righteous suffer, why the world is so hostile, why evil seems to prosper. It's because there's a cosmic war happening here. And right now, Belial's forces are in control, but not for long. And this is the exact same pattern that we see with the chronicler. Experiencing suffering leads to theological development. And part of that development is externalizing evil into a separate figure, at least for these guys. Beelzebul is interesting because it shows how foreign gods actually got demonized. Because the original name is probably Baal-zebul, which means Baal the prince. So Baal was a Canaanite god. He was a storm and I think fertility as well. But he was eventually, he had some dealings with the underworld and the realm of the dead and had some dealings with Mot, the god of the dead. But essentially, the Israelites mockingly changed it to Baal-zebub, which means Lord of the Flies. It's an insult. So instead of calling him a prince, you're calling him the Lord of the Insects. And I think there's a book about that. I don't know. I haven't read it. But by the time you get to the New Testament, Beelzebul is being used as another name for Satan. The Gospels explicitly identify them. In Matthew 12, the Pharisees accused Jesus of casting out demons by Beelzebul, the prince of demons. And Jesus responds with, well, if Satan casts out Satan, he's divided against himself. So Beelzebul equals Satan. And that connection makes sense, right? Baal was a storm god. Yeah. He was a storm god in Canaanite religion who descended into the underworld in the midst of them. And then he battled Mot, the actual god of death. And the connection between Baal and the realm of the dead comes from this mythological descent, making him associated with death even though he fought against it. So when the Israelites demonized Baal as Beelzebul, they connected him with Satan, who also brought death into the world and became associated with the underworld realm. Satan, through the Genesis 3 rebellion, introduced death and became the king of the realm of the dead. Baal was a foreign god opposing Yahweh. Satan is the cosmic adversary opposing God. So here's what I want you to see, and there's a reason why I bring up all these names. Mastema, Belial, Beelzebul, Diablos even, the devil, Satan, they're all describing the same adversarial reality. They're not different devils, they're seemingly different names that highlight different aspects of this figure's character and role. Satan means adversary. Mastema means hatred. Belial means worthlessness and wickedness. Beelzebul means ruler of demons, lord of the dead. Diablos means slanderer or deceiver. And the biblical writers weren't bound by some cosmic rule that they had to use the same vocabulary every time. If the shoe fits, just let them wear it. Each name tells you something true about who this figure is and what he does. And the reason we see this explosion of names in the Second Temple period is because this is when the concept of Satan started to become fully developed. Different communities are wrestling with the same theological problems. There's suffering, there's persecution, there's evil, and they're ultimately arriving at similar solutions. You have a cosmic adversary, a prince of darkness, a tempter and accuser who explains evil without blaming God. And with that, we've traced how Satan evolved from a title to a name and how different names for this character emerged. But we still haven't answered the original question. When does the serpent in Genesis 3 become Satan? Because remember, Genesis never calls the serpent Satan. The Hebrew Bible never calls the serpent in Genesis 3 Satan. So when does that connection get made? Well, during the Second Temple period, Jewish readers actually start going back through the Torah with this new understanding. They've got this developed concept of a new cosmic evil figure now, whether they call him Satan, Mastema, Belial, whatever. And interestingly enough, they actually start connecting the dots. Genesis 3 is the story of how death entered the world, how paradise was lost, how humanity fell, and there's this mysterious serpent who causes it all. A creature who speaks, who deceives, who opposes God's command. And the Second Temple Jews start thinking, wait, this has to be the adversary. This has to be the same thing the same figure that we're dealing with now, the one who tempts humanity, the one who brought death to humanity, the one who opposes God's purposes. So it's seemingly they retroactively read Satan back into Genesis 3. But now I want you to hold that thought for a second. Before we go further, we have to talk about something this is so fascinating to me in the Hebrew text itself, because the word for serpent in Genesis 3 is doing something incredibly clever here. So quickly, the Hebrew word for serpent in Genesis 3 referring to Satan is nachash. And you like my Hebrew there? And this word is a triple entendre. It has three overlapping meanings, and the author of Genesis is using them all at the same time. The first meaning is serpent. So that's what most English translations go with. Now, the serpent was more crafty. It's seemingly like a creature. The second meaning is that it means shining one. The word nachash comes from a root word that means to shine or to gleam. This is why in ancient languages the word means bronze or copper, because they shine when polished. So the nachash in Eden isn't just described as a serpent. In the original Hebrew, it's a shining one or a radiant being. The third meaning is enchanter or diviner. So the verb form of nahash means to practice divination, to seek omens, or to enchant. So there's this built-in association with the forbidden supernatural knowledge and deception. So when in Genesis 3 verse 1 says, now the nachash was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made, the Hebrew is giving you all of these layers at the same time. So it's a serpent, but it's also signaling that this is a shining one, a divine being, a member of God's heavenly host. And it is involved in the deception and forbidden knowledge. The nachash is practicing enchantment. And so the text is intentionally ambiguous. It's giving you multiple levels of meaning simultaneously, which to me is really amazing. And this makes perfect sense when you think about the story. How does a snake talk? Like, how does it reason and deceive? How does it know what God commanded? How does it have the theological sophistication to question God's word? Because this being isn't just a snake. It might not even be a snake at all. But what it is, though, is a divine rebel in the form of a serpent, a shining one who brought darkness, an enchanter who seduced humanity away from God. Genesis 3 doesn't spell this out explicitly, but the wordplay is there and the layers are there, and the original readers would have picked up on this. They would have understood that this is more than just an animal. This is a supernatural rebellion. So when someone asks you, was it a literal snake in the Garden of Eden? The answer is yes, but also no, but also yes, but also it's a little complicated, which is basically the answer to every interesting, question about the Bible, if we're being honest. But going back to the names of Satan that I was just talking about, there's this idea called progressive revelation. God doesn't reveal everything all at once. He reveals truth gradually over time. The earlier texts give you pieces of the picture, and the later texts fill in more details, and eventually you get the full image. The Genesis author didn't need to say Satan, capital S, in chapter 3, because that's not how their original audience would have understood it anyway. They just knew that this was a rebel, an adversary, a supernatural being who brought catastrophe. But as God's people experienced more history, more suffering, more revelation, the picture got clearer. The pieces started to connect. And by the time you get to the New Testament, you can look back at Genesis 3 and say, oh, yeah, that was Satan all along. But the first explicit connection between the devil and Genesis 3 appears in a text called the Wisdom of Solomon, written around 50 BC. It says that through the devil's envy, death entered the world. Now, that's a clear reference to Genesis 3. The devil, the adversary, brought death through his rebellion in the garden. Now, back to the book of Jubilees, as well as the book of Enoch, both written in this period, they develop elaborate fallen angelology. They connect Satan to the Watchers, the rebellious angels in Genesis 6. They build this whole backstory about how these angels fell, how they corrupted humanity, how their punishment resulted in demons. And all of this is part of the same process, taking the pieces from the Hebrew Bible and assembling them into a coherent narrative about this cosmic, rebellion. And by the time you get to the New Testament, that reading is just assumed. Paul writes in Romans 16, verse 20, he says, the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. That's also a direct reference to Genesis 3:15. I think they use the term proto-evangelium. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, and he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Paul's essentially saying, yeah, the serpent whose head will be crushed, that's Satan. And Jesus is the offspring of the woman who does the crushing. Also, in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 3, Paul says, I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his coming, your minds will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. So there again, we have the serpent who deceived Eve. Paul's assuming that his readers know that was Satan. But neither of these passages explicitly say that the serpent is Satan. They assume the connection, but they don't state it outright. So then where does the Bible actually definitively make the identification of this guy? Revelation. More specifically, Revelation chapter 12, verse 9. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And there it is, the ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan. Also, again in Revelation 20, verse 2. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. This is the moment in the Bible where it explicitly, unmistakably identifies the serpent in Genesis 3 with Satan. The dragon is the ancient serpent who is the devil, who is Satan. All the same figure. So why does this explicit identification not happen until literally the last book of the Bible? Well, because that's how the Bible works. I'd argue that it's not a systematic theology textbook, rather it's a narrative. A story told through real people, through real history, with real development. Now, the truth of it was always in there. Like the serpent in Genesis 3 was always the adversary. He was the original rebel, the one who brought death and destruction to the world. But the full picture, the complete understanding of who he is, what his role is in history, and how all these pieces connect, that just wasn't born in a vacuum. That came gradually, piece by piece, text by text, century by century, until finally in Revelation, John can look back across all of the Bible, all of Scripture, and say, you know that ancient serpent from the very beginning, that devil who opposed Jesus, they're all the same guy, and his defeat is certain. And with that, we have established that biblically, Satan is the ancient serpent, the shining one, the Nachash from Eden, the divine rebel who took the form of the serpent. But here's a question. When you picture Satan right now, what do you see? I'm going to guess it's not a snake. Well, actually, it might be. But it's probably not a shiny angelic being. You might be picturing a red guy with horns, a pointed tail, maybe a pitchfork, maybe a goatee, perhaps. The classic devil look, the one you see on Halloween decorations. And my question is, well, if this is the development that we have, how did we get from snake to red guy with pitchfork? Like, where did that come from? Because I can tell you right now, that ain't in the Bible. But let's be clear about what the Bible does tell us and doesn't tell us about Satan's appearance. The serpent in Genesis 3, we've covered that it's the Nachash, the serpent, shining one, enchanter. I already talked about that. Revelation describes him as a dragon, an ancient serpent. Revelation 12:3 says that he's a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. So red, yeah, but also 7 heads and 10 horns. This is clearly apocalyptic imagery, not a literal physical description. But nowhere, and I mean nowhere, does the Bible describe Satan as a red humanoid figure with 2 horns, a tail, and a pitchfork. So where did that image come from? Here's what happened. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire and into medieval Europe, Christian artists needed a way to visually represent evil. And they looked around at the religious imagery that they already had. And what they had a lot of was Greek and Roman art depicting nature gods and underworld figures. For example, Pan, the Greek god of nature, he was a half man and half goat. He had horns, he had hooves, sometimes he was depicted with a tail. There were these things called satyrs, which were woodland spirits. They were also a half goat and had horns, known for being mischievous and leading people into temptation and debauchery. Hades and Pluto, underworld gods associated with death and the realm below and darkness. And the early Christian church was actively trying to, obviously for very good reasons, distance itself from pagan religions. So they demonized these figures, literally. They took the imagery associated with pagan gods and said, yeah, those ain't gods, those are demons. And their leader, You know, that's the devil. It's brilliant, actually, because if you want people to stop worshiping Pan, you make Pan look like Satan. And suddenly, that god that you used to worship, well, he's actually the embodiment of evil entirely, so you should probably stop doing that. And so by the medieval period, 1000 to 1400 AD, this imagery is kind of everywhere. And then churches are being built with sculptures and paintings, and they need to depict the last judgment, and then heaven, and then hell, and then angels and demons. And they need Satan to look scary and recognizable, for obvious reasons. Unfortunately, maybe. But so they go with the horns, the red skin. Red is fire and hell and eternal punishment. And then you have the tail, sometimes wings, but like bat wings, ugly ones, not the beautiful feathered wings of angels, which I have a video on angels coming up, and I'll leave it there. And here's the thing. Most people in medieval Europe couldn't read. So these images were hugely important because this is how you learned theology. You looked at the art in the church. So when every church depicts Satan with horns and red skin, that just becomes what Satan looks like in the cultural imagination of the time. Then, and let me know if you want me to make a full video on this part, because I probably should. In 1320, Dante Alighieri writes the Divine Comedy, which is a 3-part series walking through hell to heaven, through the Inferno, hell, Purgatorio, purgatory, and Paradiso. He was Catholic, so that was like a purgatory thing. At least I think he was Catholic. But specifically the Inferno section, which is basically a guided tour through hell. And Dante gets very creative here. His Satan is enormous, trapped in ice at the center of hell, and he has 3 faces, 6 wings, chewing on the 3 worst sinners in history: Judas, Brutus, and Cassius. Romans. This becomes one of the most influential pieces of literature in Western history. Artists start to paint it, and it shapes how people think about hell and the devil for centuries. But now, Dante's Satan doesn't look exactly like the red devil we picture today, but Dante's work definitely reinforces the idea that we can and should visually depict Satan in vivid, creative, terrifying ways. And, one detail, the pitchfork, that's probably from the Hades / Pluto, the Greek Roman god of the underworld, who carried a bident, which was a two-pronged spear. So a trident means 3, bident means whatever. Mix that imagery with Satan as the ruler of hell, and boom, you have a devil with a pitchfork. Perfect for poking sinners or whatever it is he does down there. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, you have political cartoons, you have literature, the advancement of theater and movies and TV shows, and the red devil becomes visual shorthand for evil, temptation, bad decisions. Shows up on one shoulder whispering bad things, and the angel sits on the other shoulder, kind of thing. So like culturally embedded that most people don't even realize that it's not even biblical. They just assume that that's what Satan looks like because that's what they've always seen. Now, is there anything wrong with artistic representations of Satan? Not necessarily. Art is art, symbolism is symbolism. But here's the issue, because when the popular image of Satan is a red guy with horns and a pitchfork, it makes him seem like kind of silly, kind of cartoonish, not like there's nothing threatening about him. He's just a Halloween costume. It's a parody. It's the devil made me do it excuse, Satan. And that unfortunately makes it really easy to not take the biblical Satan seriously. Because the biblical Satan, he's not a guy in a red suit with a pitchfork. He is the ancient serpent, the shining one who fell, the cosmic adversary who brought death into God's creation, the accuser, the deceiver of nations. The New Testament calls him the prince of the power of the air, a spiritual reality, a rebellious divine being with real power in real malice. 2 Corinthians, Paul even tells us that he disguises himself as an angel of light. So he's not showing up in a red suit announcing, "Hello, it's me, the devil, and I'm very evil, and I'm going to say a lot of mean things to you." He's subtle, deceptive. He looks good. He's attractive, and he sounds reasonable. That's way more dangerous than a cartoon devil. So here's the point of, quite honestly, this whole video. The popular image of Satan, red skin, horns, tail, pitchfork, comes from a mix of Greek and Roman mythology, medieval Christian art, and centuries of cultural reinforcement. It's not biblical at all. The Bible describes Satan as a serpent, a dragon, a shining being, an angel of light, a roaring lion going to devour people, a deceiver. And honestly, the biblical descriptions of that are way scarier because they show us an enemy who's intelligent, deceptive, and doesn't announce himself. The red devil is easy to spot and easy to dismiss. The angel of light, that's the one that you actually need to watch out for. So we've established that by the New Testament, Satan is this fully developed cosmic adversary. But there's still one more question that we need to answer. If there are multiple rebellions in the Bible, in the biblical narrative, Eden, the Watchers in Genesis 6, the Tower of Babel, why does the Eden rebel become the archvillain? Why is it he the one who gets all the titles? God of this world, the prince of the power of the air, the ruler of demons. Why does he get preeminence over all the other rebellious powers? First, there's an issue of being first. He's the original rebel, the first one to have the quote unquote courage to challenge God and oppose what God wants to do. This matters in the spiritual hierarchy. He sets the pattern. All subsequent rebellions follow his lead. But that's not the main reason. The main reason is through this. Through his rebellion in Genesis 3, death ultimately enters the world. Before the garden, humans were created to live forever in fellowship with God. Death wasn't even a part of that equation. But the serpent rebels. He deceives humans. They rebel. And the consequence is, now you're going to die. And when you die, where do you go? Sheol, the realm of the dead, the underworld. Well, you want to know who runs that place? The same rebel from Eden. Genesis 3:14, the curse upon the serpent, upon your belly you shall go, in the dust you shall eat the rest of the days of your life. And the Hebrew word there for earth is eretz, and eretz can mean the ground, the earth, the land, but it's also one of the terms used for the underworld, the realm beneath. So the serpent is not only just cast down to the ground, not just to the ground, but literally to the lowest realm. He wanted to be at the highest level, opposing God, making the rules, but now he's literally at the lowest level, beneath the hooves of literally the animals, in the realm of the dead. And the curse says that he'll eat the dust all the days of his life. In ancient Near Eastern imagery, eating dust is what dead do. It's a picture of being given to the underworld. So Satan basically got demoted from shining heavenly being to guy who eats dirt in Sheol. So this rebel becomes the king of the realm of the dead. And here's why that matters. All of the other principalities and powers, all the other rebellious spiritual beings, they can do whatever they want. They can abuse humans, they can lead them astray, they can cause destruction and suffering, but at the end of the day, everything dies. Everything ends up in the realm of the dead, which means everything ends up at his doorstep, at his domain. This is why Paul calls him the God of this world in 2 Corinthians, because now, after Genesis 3, the world is just defined by death, and he is the king of death. This is also why I think Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14 says that Jesus came to destroy the one who has power over death, that is, the devil. The air, the space between heaven and earth, is where dead spirits dwell. It's his territory. This is why all the other powers defer to him, because they know at the end of the day, we're all going to die. And when we do, we're going to end up at his house. So the Genesis 3 rebel gets so much more focus on him, not just because he was the first, but because his rebellion had the greatest reach. It affected all of humanity. It introduced the thing that all humans share, death. And it made him the ruler of the realm where all humans go. That's why he emerges as the archvillain. All right, so through all of that, through everything that we just talked about, let's bring it all together and let's understand why this matters. By the time we get to the New Testament, all the pieces have come together. All the names, all the roles, all the different angles, they all point to the same figure, seen from different angles, described in different languages, and understood with increasing clarity over time. And the story he's part of is the story of this one of cosmic rebellion and God's victory. And here's the thing. That story has an ending. Genesis 3 made the promise of he will crush your head and you will strike his heel. Romans 16:20 confirms it by revealing that the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. Revelation seals it by confirming that the devil who has been deceived was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. The outcome of this whole thing was never in doubt. From the moment the curse was pronounced in Genesis 3, Satan's defeat was certain. All of history since then has been the playing out of that predetermined victory. Christ's death and resurrection is the decisive blow, the head-crushing moment. The serpent struck Jesus' heel at the cross, but in rising from the dead, Jesus crushed the serpent's head, defeated death, and broke Satan's power. And now, We are living in this mop-up operation. Satan's still active. He's still dangerous. He's still deceiving the nations. But ultimately, he's already defeated. He's just thrashing around until the final judgment, bringing as many people with him as possible. And when that final judgment comes, Revelation tells us exactly what happens. He's thrown into the lake of fire forever. So here's what makes all this so fascinating to me. The Bible's telling us one story. This huge cosmic war there's a rescue mission and a family reunion at the end of all of it. But it tells that story over 1,500 years through dozens of authors across multiple languages and cultures. And you can actually watch, it's so fascinating, you can actually watch the pieces come together. The serpent in Eden doesn't need to be called Satan in Genesis 3 because that's not what the original readers would have called him. They just knew that he was the rebel, the adversary, the one who brought death. But as God's people experienced more history and more suffering and more questions, they went back to their own scriptures and they found answers that were already there. All of the pieces were there. They just needed to be connected. And by the time John writes Revelation, he looks back and he says, that prince of darkness, it's all the same guy, and Jesus crushed his head. I think there's something really fascinating about that, and honestly quite remarkable. The story they're telling is that there's an enemy, there's a battle, there's a cost, but there's a victory. And the outcome to them was never in doubt. For us, never in doubt. From the moment that the curse was pronounced in Genesis 3, Satan's defeat was certain. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel. All of history since then has been the playing out of that predetermined victory. And it's that, I think, that makes studying Satan's evolution in the Bible so worth it. Because it shows us a God who works through history, who reveals truth gradually, who gives the people what they need and helps them see the fuller picture over time, and who, from the very beginning, had a plan to crush the serpent's head. So, thank you for watching. If you found this interesting, please consider hitting the subscribe button as it helps out my channel a lot. And there's a lot more weird Bible stuff to come. And I know there's probably a handful of questions that went unanswered. You know, I only have so much time, but I guess that's what making other videos is for. Thank you all so much for watching. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.